nearly 3 years ago, and it was at a time when there was a lot of sentiment, popular sentiment that actually the Assad regime would fall. And he gave a talk about this, and he told us it's not going to happen anytime soon. It's going to be a long, long war. And here we are, and the Assad regime is still around. And we have talked now about the Americans negotiating with it or not. So Yazid Saeed is, as I said, a senior associate at Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where his work focuses on a number of issues from the Syrian crisis, political role, power boundary, security sector transformation, and so on in Arab transitions. He was previously a professor at King's College, long-time professor of Middle East Studies at King's College in London. He has also he worked previously at the Center for International Studies in Cambridge, and also at the International Institute for Security Studies. And he was also part of an advisor and negotiator in the Palestinian delegation of the peace talks between 1991 and 1994. Our other two speakers, immediately to my right, is Shaban Kardash, who is the director of, the president of Forsam, the Middle East Strategic Research Center in Ankara, and also a professor of international relations at Tob University of Economics and Technology. Shaban, I think, is well known to many of you, especially most of you Turkish audience here. Regularly appears in the media. He's also an editor in the quarterly journal Perceptions, and also a contributor to GMF's On Turkey series. And then the third speaker is my colleague in the Department of International Relations, Soli Özel, who is both at the department and also the foreign news editor of Haberturk Daily and an advisor to Susiad. Soli is also somebody that everybody seems to know in Turkey and abroad. He's also a contributor to the GMF on Turkey series and for a number of other journals and newspapers in Turkey or abroad. And so all three speakers have something different to contribute to our topic today, which is one which keeps evolving. It has been evolving over the last few years. And as I said, there's a dimension that's linked to Assad and Syria, even though yes, it would focus a bit on Iraq, in particular the Islamic State. But you know, the issue is all the issues at hand. Here we have a non-state transnational actor playing a role in reshaping, maybe, or not, the region of the Middle East, which raises issues about the legitimacy of non-state actors in today's world, and as well as state actors and their regimes. What has been the response to date, which has been one which is more of a military nature as opposed to incorporating social and political dimensions to it? What sort of divides have emerged? Cleavages, Sunni-Sunni divides, Sunni-Shia divides, and others that are a factor here. The Kurds have a role to play as well. Is a possible Sunni, another question awakening, possible to fight the radicalization of the Islamic State? As one had, for example, in the 2006-2008 period, civil war that got rid of Al-Qaeda in a way, or deflated Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Then I was watching, and I have the transcript here, last week, King Abdullah of Jordan gave a very interesting speech in the European Parliament. And you know, Jordan has been one of the countries that is considerably under threat from what is happening. And I just want to quote a little bit from what he said. And I suggest you find the video. It's available on YouTube, and you know, he's a very good speaker and a very powerful speaker. And he said, "We and other Arab and Muslim states defend not only our people, but our faith. So this is a fight that has to be carried out by Muslim nations, first and foremost, a fight within Islam, with reference to the Islamic State. And at the same time, the danger of extremism must be seen for what it is, global. The threat is not only in Syria and Iraq, it has also struck, and we know it by reading the news and following it, Libya, Yemen, Mali, Nigeria, where we even have Boko Haram now claiming some sort of allegiance to ISIS, the Horn of Africa, Asia, the Americas, Australia, and so on. And so this also raises an issue about what is there an international community that is united in fighting the Islamic State? What are the positions of the regional actors, some of which appear to be contradictory in terms of their narratives of what has happened, why it's happening, and what should be done to fight the Islamic State? What is the role for Europe? I mean, as a European citizen, it's something I think about and worry about a lot, and there's a lot of talk about it. Europe stepping up, but how will it step up, under what conditions? So these are some of the issues, and of course, the impact also of the refugees on the states, on the countries where they flow to, and what this actually means in terms of radicalization or not of Muslim communities. So these are just some of the issues I'm just putting on the table. But we will start off with Yazid Said and then move on to Shaban Kardash and then Soli Yozel. Let them speak for 10-15 minutes each, and then we can have a nice discussion. We can answer your questions. So Yazid.
Thanks, Dimitri, for the very kind and warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here again. I'm always very impressed when I come into Tadilha's campus in many different ways, not just the architecture and the restaurant. But this is a fascinating subject. What I'm going to say is simply to throw out a few ideas to start a discussion. I'm not going to attempt to provide a comprehensive analysis or complete predictions. We have, I think, a fair amount of time to open up in discussion and go in any other direction you might wish. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit about the Islamic State, how I see the Islamic State, what I think it's really, what kind of creature is it really? And that helps us understand whether it can survive and win or lose, etc., and what is needed to defeat it. And then to connect that with the question of what happens to Iraq. I mean, what is Iraq? What will Iraq be once the Islamic State is hopefully defeated? No one's really focusing on that, although the causes for the rise of the Islamic State have all to do with the failures and failings of the Iraqi state, none of which are being addressed. And therefore, why should we expect a new outcome, a different outcome, even if one group like the Islamic State is defeated? That doesn't necessarily end the problem. And so it's only in that context that I might refer to the US or other actors, the sorts of questions that Mitch was raising about the European Union or the US policy and others, or implications for Turkey, which I know that my colleagues Shaban and Soli will address. I won't really focus on. First, on the Islamic State, I just want to give you a very few sort of summary ideas of mine. And they don't necessarily agree with much of what you read in the papers or even from think tanks in the West and other places, where the emphasis is on the pure ideology of the Islamic State. That they're Islamist, that they're a certain kind of Islamist, that they're extreme, that they want to create the emirate, the caliphate, implement the Quran, all these things. Now these are true. I mean, they are genuine parts of the Islamic State ideological discourse. Although if you speak to, or for those who have interviewed Islamic State prisoners, I mean people, fighters of the Islamic State who fallen prisoner in Iraq or Syria, and other communications, it's clear that a lot of them haven't even read the Quran. So as usual, there's a core leadership which has a clear ideology and that utilizes ideology in a certain way for a political purpose. So ideology is important, but we need to explore how and why that ideology is important. Who is it important to? What does it make them do? How does it affect political behavior? And one thing I want to start out by saying straight away is that in my view, the Islamic State, above all else, is an authoritarian, totalitarian organization that happens to use Islam as its formal ideology. What is the difference between that and, say, the Iraqi state of Saddam Hussein, who was supposedly secular, who led the Ba'ath Party, which is committed to Arab socialism and to nationalism, secular concepts? In terms of torture, killing, beheading, public displays of power and violence, etc., use of ideology and use of finances to create power, the Islamic State is the clone of Saddam's state. I think it's the exact same state in terms of its political behavior. The fact that one uses Islam, one used Arab nationalism, a third might use socialism, all these are forms of authoritarian or totalitarian power. And frankly, I just don't see what difference it makes. So people, especially in the West, who say this is about the essence of Islam, I think are missing the point. This is the essence of authoritarianism, a particularly brutal form of authoritarianism. We need to ask why is Islam at this time, in this place? That's where we have to think, okay, so who are the real social base of the Islamic State? And the core, in my view, of the Islamic State is still Iraqi. It's Iraqi Sunnis, many of them from the Saddam-era state. Intelligence officers, army officers, administrators, bankers, whose notion of the right, the innate right, the inherent right of the Sunnis to rule Iraq since the time Iraq was created in the 1920s, for them this has been changed. There's something wrong with the natural order, that they no longer rule. But it's not just that. These are also Sunni Iraqi Arabs from particular parts of Iraq, in which clan relations, clan or tribal societal relations are extremely important. So whereas Saddam Hussein ruled over the whole of Iraq and had resources and assets of nationalism that came to Arab nationalism, to fight for Palestine, to have a big army, to bring in Shia and Sunnis and Kurds into a patronage system, into public services. By the time by the 1980s, probably there were more Shia Arabs in the Ba'ath Party than there were Sunni Arabs, for instance. Saddam could bring all of this together in a way that the Islamic State cannot, because it has defined itself, in a sense, as representing specifically the Sunni component of Iraqi society, the Sunni Arab component, and even more the provincial component of Sunni Arab society. Now that isn't to say that it can't be more than that, but I'm just trying to situate it, to say this is a political organization, it comes from somewhere, it has a social base. All politics reflects a social reality. So the Islamic State's organizational structure is still heavily based on the core leadership provided almost entirely by Iraqis. Only in the Shura Council, this sort of consultative assembly, do you have representatives of people from Saudi Arabia or Syria and so on. Now I don't want to go too much on about that, but I just want to sort of remind you that a lot of the way in which the Islamic State is analyzed treats it as if it's come with, there's no history, no legacy, we have nothing like this in history. Well, that's not true. I lived in Iraq in the mid-70s, and there were things happening in the mid-70s I could see in terms of the portrayal of violence on public television or in other means of imagery, how the regime consciously used violence and fear as a method of ensuring compliance and obedience by its people. The Islamic State, when it puts out a video of something really brutal, they're not addressing us, we're horrified, but they're addressing the people they care about and who they want to impact or to influence. So what they're doing is, to my mind, what many authoritarian governments do. Now, we could go later into a discussion of how they've extended into Syria, and it's interesting if you notice, I'm not going to go into much detail, I'm going to make one point to reinforce what I've been saying so far about the natural social constituency, or the base. Islamic State has extended in parts of Syria that are closest to Iraq, where Syrian society is heavily clan-based. And if you notice, if you look at a map today of the zones of control of the Islamic State versus the zones of control of the regime or of other rebel groups, including Jabhat al-Nusra, which you will know is an Islamic jihadist al-Qaeda organization, you'll see that the Islamic State's line reaches around Aleppo and then down through the desert towards Homs and the steppes, the Badia desert, to the east of Damascus. That is exactly where local society is very heavily clan-based. And many of these clans are the same clans that are on the other side of the border in Iraq. But the moment that ISIS, the Islamic State, reached Western Syria, where there's densely populated agricultural regions and urban regions, the local society is Sunni, Arab, but not based on clan structures in the same way. And that's where Jabhat al-Nusra is strong for other historical and sociological reasons. And the Islamic State has not been able to develop a real base. This is not to say that only clan people will join Islamic State and non-clan people won't join. I'm not being deterministic, but I'm just pointing out that there is a logic behind who goes where people find support. Now I need to move on, because of the time constraints, to allow more time for our discussion, to Iraq. Because I've started by emphasizing that the Islamic State is fundamentally an Iraqi phenomenon. Its core strength arises in Iraq. If it's defeated in Iraq, I don't see it existing or surviving anywhere else, even in Syria. Its presence in Syria is far more superficial or shallow. Which is not to say it doesn't have local support, but if people had any other viable alternative, they would probably prefer the alternative over ISIS. But in Syria, the alternatives are not much better. Islamic State's reputation in Syria and in Iraq is brutal maybe, but they have a reputation for providing security and a court system, if you like. That when it comes to commercial disputes, to property disputes, to these sort of basic day-to-day things, people think they live in a predictable system, they know where to go to, and they can get a decision from a court in 1 or 2 days. This was impossible under the Assad regime, for instance. So all the reports that come out from ISIS areas may show that people are suffering in many ways. One thing they all say is that they have better security, even now, under bombardment, than they had under any other authority, of the Baghdad government, of the Damascus government, of the Syrian rebels. And that is critical. So, since Iraq is so pivotal, let's look for a moment at the Iraqi state. Since the US invasion in 2003, the removal of Saddam Hussein, the de-Ba'athification with which the entire apparatus, not only of the army and the police, was dismantled, but in effect, the top 4 or 5 layers of the civil service and the state administration were entirely removed. The Iraqi state was a strong state. I mean, it was quite a developed state, in bad ways, but also in good ways. I mean, it delivered administrative functions. This was taken apart, and the system that emerged afterwards was one based on patronage, in a way that hadn't been seen since the 1960s. I.e., if you belong to a particular community or a particular party or a particular region, then if your party or community or whatever representative got seats in parliament and then got a ministry given to them in the cabinet, then that ministry would become the source of finances, jobs, patronage, welfare for that community or that group. And so the logic of the central state providing efficient services, which was Saddam Hussein's logic. I mean, I hated the man, but he was very emphatic about service delivery. And if his ministers didn't deliver, they were fired or put in prison. He crushed corruption. The new system has been based entirely on corruption. And to give you one statistic, I have this from an Iraqi economist who's an energy expert, and this is a statistic for 2002 to 2013. The Iraqi government spent $500 billion of public money. And in that 10-year time period, they did not build one single hospital or one single electricity power plant. 500 billion. Not one new hospital, not one new power plant. In a country that is desperately, suffering desperate health conditions and constant power shortages, which has effects for everything, from health to the economy to whatever else. That gives you a sense of the problem of the Iraqi state. Last summer we saw the Iraqi army, or big parts of it, collapse within hours or days of confronting the Islamic State. That means there's a problem in the Iraqi army. Since then, the new Prime Minister has revealed that there were at least 50,000 ghost soldiers taking salaries. Well, they were taking salaries, their commanders were. The level of corruption in the Iraqi army reached the point where basically officers buy their commissions and they get the rank they can afford. And the more they can afford, the more opportunities for corruption. It's a simple commercial game. It's like having a shop, Istiklal Jadasi. It's worth it, right? And if you can afford to be on Istiklal, you'll get more business. And if not, you go sit somewhere else. And if you want to be an officer in the Iraqi army and make more money, then you need to pay more to get a better rank or to be appointed to a battalion or in a region, an office, a department where there are more opportunities for making money. That's the Iraqi army, built after years of investment by the US, years of training, years of restructuring, and this was the new Iraqi army. And that's just one example. Health, education, public works, infrastructure works, the oil sector, it's all like this. So what we have now, and here's where I'm going to wrap up and hand over, you now hear about the latest central government offensive to retake the city of Mosul in the north, which is south of Diyarbakir, and they're now fighting for the city of Tikrit, which is Saddam Hussein's original hometown. Now, the Baghdad government has a huge problem, first of all, of regaining the trust and cooperation of the Sunni community. A few years ago, under Maliki, there was a negotiation and 18 items were agreed between the Sunni representatives and the Baghdad government to do with human rights, an end to unlawful detention, end to torture, budgets, transparency, a number of different things. The reinstatement of officers in the police and army who had been expelled, etc. None of these 18 things were then implemented by the Baghdad government. Now, since the removal of Maliki as Prime Minister and his replacement with Abadi, there was talk of turning a new leaf and having a new political deal. Now, we all know what the deal requires. The details were negotiated 4 or 5 years ago. There's nothing new there. There have always been Sunnis in parliament, always been Sunnis in government. It's not as if they weren't there. They were there. But these people lost legitimacy. They were seen as corrupt, as playing the game. So what's happened now is there's been a game of musical chairs. You probably, in other words, they just rotate some of the faces and sort of give out more shares to different groups. There has not yet been the rise of a genuinely new Sunni leadership who more genuinely represents the Sunni community. So we have a large Sunni community that is angry and alienated, that still does not trust the new government. And before the deal is revived and implemented, the government is already mobilizing tens of thousands of troops, mostly Shia from the south, to go fight in the mostly Sunni areas of the north, without yet having fixed the political problems, without yet having started, even officially put on the agenda, a reform process, saying honestly, our state is corrupt. We are going to reform the Ministry of Finance. We are going to reform the Ministry of Defense. We are going to reform education, health services, public works. And here's what we're going to do. And we're going to have a dialogue with civil society, with political parties in each area. We're going to devolve more responsibility, more budgets to provincial councils. None of this yet has been said, let alone implemented. Without this, the Iraqi state has no hope of surviving and no hope of maintaining its unity. So we're left, I think, with a situation where whatever the outcome of the battle with the Islamic State in the next few months or the next 1 or 2 years, what is happening is that the urgency of fighting the military confrontation is being used to avoid dealing with these deep problems of the Iraqi state and of the Iraqi political system. And in a way, victory against the Islamic State might be the worst thing, because it will empower those people in the central government who say, why should we give the Sunni community any concessions? They're hostile anyway. Or they will give power to the new Shia militias that have been built to work parallel to the army. Instead of strengthening the army, what we have is a new parallel Shia army. And the Americans want to build a new parallel Sunni army. All of this is taking apart the central state even more. Victory, I think, against the Islamic State will not resolve any of the problems. On the contrary, I think will come at the expense of starting seriously to tackle these problems. And from there on, we may be looking either at Iraq becoming like Syria, or maybe becoming like Lebanon during the Civil War, i.e. self-governing separate cantons in the south and the center and the north. We already have Kurdistan as a semi-independent area. We may find something like that in the south and in the Sunni areas with a lot of violence all the time, continuing corruption, continuing decline of public services. That is a failed state, and that's what we face next, I think, in Iraq. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Which I think you raised a number of issues. You're right, that are not what is out there in the conventional analysis. And especially striking is a whole contrast with the services, the delivery and what this actually means for the current Iraqi state. And this is where the Islamic State's strength lies, in a way, the security factor. We talk about reception. But then I'll move on to Shaban.
Thanks a lot, for this invitation. And happy to be here with some of my former students who are doing their master's here, and also some of the other friends and professors. I am fascinated by the first speaker, and it is rare to speak about this subject without ever mentioning European journalism, because these days when we talk about Iraq, Syria, unfortunately, most of the discussions are focusing on the popular parts, or negative parts of the problem, but are missing the root causes of the issues we are being confronted with. And then Yazid did a wonderful job outlining how what we discussed today as images we see on screens in terms of behaviors and other stuff are deeply rooted in social and political realities of the two countries that are directly affected by the ISIS phenomenon. And then, as our event is mostly focused on Iraq, I will also try to reflect a little bit about my own take on Iraqi angle of ISIS, which is not very different from Yazid's. I think it is important to underline that although now we talk about ISIS and in the context of both Syria and Iraq, in the two specific cases, there are different drivers, there are different dynamics of the problem. And then the foreign fighters, the foreign jihadists, quote-unquote, angle is more visible in the case of Syrian conflict than the Iraqi one. In the case of the Iraqi ISIS, the local reality, the local dynamics are stronger than in Syria, I think. And this is where we have to talk about the Sunni marginalization and resentment which has been driving ISIS advance throughout the Iraqi and Syrian conflicts. Personally, I think ISIS is the product of the breaking down of the regional order, in the sense that the unmanaged conflict in Syria, which later split over into Iraq, did shake the foundations of the regional order. Now, the issue of the borders are open for question. The issue of the sovereign and national authority, they are being eroded. We see the empowerment of the non-state and sub-state actors and identities. And in this process, we see the lack of conflict resolution mechanism in the Middle East, which is effective. And the traditional providers of security, the Western, the American commitment, are not there to the extent that it used to be. And the lack of regional conflict resolution mechanism and security architecture, which we discuss a lot in the case of Europe. But as a result, the regional rivalry among the key players, including Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, they are also feeding the dynamics on the ground toward war fragmentation and radicalization and militarization. And as a result, I think ISIS found a very fertile ground in the case of Syria and Iraq to turn the Salafi militant ideology into practice. So in that sense, I think the ideological dimension should not be overlooked, but the ideological dimension should not be used to explain the whole phenomenon. I completely agree that by focusing on the ideology alone, we will miss a big part of the problem, especially in the case of Iraq. We have to look at rather the social and political realities of the country. In Iraq and in Syria, as I said, the drivers of the problem are different. In Syria, it was mostly the dynamics of the Syrian opposition from the very beginning. Their own fragmentation, radicalization, and militarization of the Syrian opposition. And in that process, the smart use of certain tactics by the Syrian regime should also be acknowledged. And also the political economy of the conflict also created a fertile environment for ISIS to expand in Syria. But later, in the case of Iraq, we know that it has emerged as a spillover of the Syrian conflict. But it did again tap into capitalize on the very actual social and political problems. Most of the time we discuss about ISIS in Iraq right after June 2014. Before that there was no mention. For instance, last year together with Solid, we were in Washington in May for the GNF. At that time I was asked to speak about the peril of Iran. And I was trying to draw the argument that we have to fight Iran, perhaps cooperate to solve the crisis in Syria, but also potential upcoming crisis in Iraq. Nobody was even paying attention. 1 month later, we had a completely different picture. I think ISIS, really in the case of Iraq, did capitalize on the existing deep social realities. This is where we see the marginalization of Sunnis. On the one hand, I am sort of sympathetic to their cause, but on the other hand, I also understand that given the demographic dynamics, political dynamics of Iraq, they are on the losing side. That's a quite normal reality. But the Sunni elite, the Sunni leadership, for a long time, could not adjust to the post-2003 reality. And this is where they, who were traditionally the elites in the country, holding the power and resources, were now finding themselves in inferior positions as visible in the parliament and other offices. They could not any longer deliver resources back to their base. I think they could not swallow, they could not adjust to this new reality. And this is where the Sunni resentment was building, and this is where we see later the alliance between the ISIS and the ex-Saddam officers becoming a major force because they could not adapt to a new life, a new reality, and they still had this desire to go back to the old days of Sunni-controlled Iraq. This was a major part of the problem, but here, in this juncture, I don't agree with so-called Maliki bashing, putting all the blame on Maliki, but still we should also put it on the table. We should also look closely on the policies of Maliki Iraq in terms of deepening those social problems in Iraq, which later turned into a political and military crisis. I think as far as the failings of the Maliki Iraq policies are concerned, whatever the achievements of the American-led invasion and later administration were there, Maliki undone some of them, many of them, which was partly because of his overplaying his hand in the sense that he was trying to monopolize power, he was trying to centralize power, in a way to, of course, bolster his own individual power inside the country. I think he overplayed his hand in a country which was already fragile, in a society which was already fragile, and in a political structure that from the very beginning had a very questionable legitimacy in the eyes of the people and political actors. And his overplaying, I think, shook very important, sensitive social tensions in the country. As was mentioned, they called the Sunni anger, the Sunni awakening. It was that even before, back in 2013, 2014. Maliki did negotiate, he tried to use force in the run-up to the elections of 2014 April in Iraq, but his mismanagement also should be acknowledged. But I also, as I said, don't agree with those who argue that Maliki was the sole responsible of what happened in Iraq after ISIS advanced in Mosul last June. And then here, the spillover from Syria into Iraq must also be acknowledged. I think the channels Iran involved here is important. Iran used to conduit its assistance to Syria through Iraq also undermine the fragile Shiite-Sunni balance in the country. As part of its strategy in Syria, Iran is still trying to recruit the Shiite people from different parts of the region as far as Afghanistan. That mobilization, Shiite mobilization inside Iraq, and also Iranian use of Iraq as a conduit for delivering its own military and other assistance to Syria, undermine the balance. I mean, as Orsan, we are doing some field work in Iraq from time to time. Our researchers do go there, and we were getting the indications of such Sunni tensions about the overreaction of the Iraqi Shiites to the conflict in Syria. That effect is also important. As a result, we got events of last year in June in 2014, where we saw the fall of Mosul, which changed the entire dynamics in the country and in the region as well. And as a result, now ISIS threat has become a national, regional, and also a global concern. But the efforts to tackle with that threat and challenge are leading to new problems. I agree with Yazid. Rather than helping solve the underlying root cause of the problems, the current measures that are being tried and implemented run the risk of further aggravating the Iraqi social tensions. He used the word urgency. I think I was going to use exactly the same word. The urgency. When you speak to the Iraqi officials, last week I was in Baghdad with a group of Turkish academics, and we stayed there for a couple of days longer to meet different people. The Speaker of the Parliament, the Speaker of the Parliament, Sheikh Hamadi. For the Iraqis, the fight against ISIS is an urgent life and death issue. And in Turkish we have the saying, denize düşen yılanı sarılır. Those who fall into the sea can just grab a snake to save himself. So I think that's the sort of mindset that's prevailing there. That's why there is a lot of short-term thinking in the policy reactions and responses, which from an outside perspective or from a long-term perspective is hard to understand. This is where I think also Turkey's policy is also understood in a different light by Iraqi actors than what Turkey thinks. Turkey's policy, at least at the level of declarations, is very similar to what Yazid said in terms of taking a long-term social, political approach. Turkey is putting less emphasis on the urgent need of military fight against Daesh or ISIS than the long-term social economic approach. But for the actors on the ground, the short-term urgency is more prevailing than the long-term. And here, as I said, the advance of ISIS capitalized on some social and political realities and problems of Iraq. And since June 2014, we see that increasingly the fight against ISIS, the new reality, is revealing even more those underlying problems of the country. Here, the ethnic sectarian balance and divisions, they are revealed every day to a larger extent. The dispute about revenue sharing in the country, this is revealed. The dispute about regions, regionalism, and most importantly from a constitutional law perspective, the issue of federalism, Iraqi federalism. These are now all up on the agenda. Right now we are just focusing on the military fight against ISIS, but the moment it is over, even before it is over, the more structural social problems about Sunni integration into the mainstream of Iraqi politics, and then rethinking about the Iraqi constitution and Iraqi federalism, I think these will be coming to the agenda. Of course, I haven't mentioned the other ethnic groups, the demands of the Kurds, the Turkmens, their new reality in the country and in the region. These are all being aggravated by the fight against Daesh. In the short term, you see some of the differences might be just postponed. You see on some fronts, the Shiite fighters, the Kurdish Peshmerga, Iraqi forces are fighting, but the moment they liberate a small village, they start to fight among each other. look at, for instance, the Turkmen town of Emirli last summer, which resisted against ISIS for a long time. Eventually it was liberated. The moment it was liberated, the Shiite forces did not let the Kurdish forces to enter the town. So you will see a lot of such intra-fighting, even among the Shiite militias that are becoming a growing international concern. We see a big inner competition. So in the long term, there are major issues. I don't want to take it long. The fight against ISIS, we can discuss it in different dimensions. On the military side, here the issue about the Iraqi army, how to restructure it. Unfortunately, it is postponed. Right now, most of the fight is conducted by the Shiite militias, or Hashdi Shabi, as they call it. Now, in international reports, you see a lot of attention on it, the revenge killing and other war crimes committed by them against the Sunnis. This is a major issue, how to tackle with that. And on the social side, the ethnic sectarian divisions, I think, have been deepened before the rise of ISIS in we are in a worse situation than before. And then, especially the fragmentation in terms of militia forces becoming the main driver of the fight, it is also leading to deeper social divisions. And the issue of Turkmen, the issue of Kurds, these will all be on the agenda. In the medium to long term, that's why we need a lot of post-conflict reconciliation, transitional justice kind of issues to go back to the root cause of the problem. I think here one important element is to, for instance, discuss about from the humanitarian perspective, we raise the issue of the refugees, the return of the displaced. I think we should also be realistic and brute about the fact that in some cases, and in many cases, the local people collaborated with ISIS against their neighbors from the different ethnic group or sectarian group. Now, with the liberation of different towns, villages, how you will ensure those people who were displaced because of the advance of the ISIS can go back to their homes, can live again peacefully with their neighbors who collaborated with ISIS against them. So these are really big social issues in the long term. But Dimitri also pointed out the issue of ideology, long-term fight against ISIS. We cannot avoid this question as King Abdullah referred to. I think this is a bigger issue, as I said, this militant Salafi interpretation of Islam. We cannot avoid it. We cannot just talk about the social realities and ignore the ideological dimension. This is also, I think, as rightly put by the King, a battle between Islam, different understandings and versions of Islam. And this is where I personally think that right now the environment in the region against the Muslim Brotherhood or more moderate groups is not a realistic one. You cannot just say that we are against ISIS, but on the other hand, or at the same time, we can penalize or criminalize Muslim Brotherhood. So now we need to have a big focus on moderation in the religion, in Islamic religion. For Turkey's policy vis-a-vis Iraq and ISIS, I don't want to go into details, so we might touch on it, but in Q&A I can come back to it. But briefly, the way I see it, there is a big pressure on Turkey to be drawn into the local dynamics, especially the Sunni marginalization. When you talk to the representatives of different Sunni groups from not only Iraq, actually Syria, Lebanon, and other parts of the region, they see sort of lack of support, being betrayed by major powers. So this resentment is creating a big fertile ground for such Salafi or more radical ideologies. That has to be addressed, and this is where there is a big expectation from Turkey to support different Sunni groups, militarily and otherwise. So Turkey's policy so far has been, in Syria, of course, there was support for the opposition, but in Iraq, Turkey is quite reluctant, hesitant about further military engagement, military contribution, but that pressure is big. So Turkey cannot avoid 100% being on the ground in Iraq and Syria. But while Turkey is under that pressure, it is also under another pressure to avoid pursuing a sectarian policy. So that's a very tightrope to walk. And then, especially, I think, as Yazid also mentioned, Turkish understanding is mostly focusing on the root cause of the problem. Always in Iraq, even before ISIS, in Syria, that Turkey is always underlining the political processes, making the political processes inclusive, so that different voices and different groups' interests can be addressed. But that inclusive approach is unfortunately finding a very hostile environment. Right now in the region, the way I see it, fragmentation, radicalization, and militarization are bigger than such inclusive policies. So that's a challenge to Turkey, but it's not a challenge to Turkey only, it's a challenge to all other regional major players and international actors. I'll start here.
Thank you, Shaban. In particular, with reference to Turkey, I don't know, let's see what Sunni thinks about it, but especially you separated something between dealing with the urgency, which is out there, and which is a gut reaction to everybody, and the fact that you need to build structures in terms of post-conflict rehabilitation and all the constitutional arrangements and so on. And this is also just as important, not more important. And this is where we try to place Turkish policy, which, yes, in many quarters is not necessarily accepted as such, right? Sorry.
Thank you. I have more questions than answers. Now, Yazid said he lived in Iraq in the 1970s, and whether we liked him or not, Saddam Hussein's authoritarianism at least attempted to be more inclusive. At the very least, however repressed the Shia may have been, they could be part of the power structure if they played the right games. The problem is, I wonder if Iraq in the 1990s was the same type, or Saddam's rule in the Iraq of the 1990s was of the same type. I suppose after the war to get him out of Kuwait and the rebellions that were so bloodily repressed, probably the nature of Saddam's authoritarianism had also become much more predatory and exclusivist. So if that is the case, who do we blame for it? Do we blame the United States for it, which is very convenient and not unjust, unfair, totally? Or do we blame regimes that consistently everywhere in the Arab world refuse to budge from whatever they consider to be the prerogatives that they have? Because the collapse of the state system or the collapse of the states can also be taken back to the American invasion and the destruction of the Iraqi administrative structure by the dissolution of the military and the very strong, very radical de-Baathification, which even the Nazis have not been subjected to. So, and finally, starting with your presentation again, we may try to analyze why IS rises and why it can sustain itself, and in my judgment, rightly argue against a very culturalist, very deterministic, very essentialist reading of IS's existence by trying to at least belittle the importance of ideology. But after we have done that, we're still stuck with it. There is an ideology. I mean, these guys have been busy destroying thousands of years of artifacts that were there when Islam was conquering all these lands, and nobody obviously bothered to actually destroy those things. So it is not something about the religion itself or the civilization itself, but it's the transformation of that language into an ideology which is nihilistic. And again, that may not be the reason as to why these guys have come about, but they apply it, they implement this, and that I think is truly a problem. Secondly, okay, the Americans came and destroyed whatever an order existed, not just in Iraq, but I think they threatened they shook the foundations of the regional order as well. which was probably going to have those problems, but this was expedited. But when, let's say, the Americans leave in 2011 on the 18th of December, again, I don't see any effort on the part of regional powers to actually come to actually try to find a political way out of the debacle and probably the struggle, the strife that was going to come either. So that's where I will start. My questions are the following. Is the IS a threat to the regional order? But is there a regional order? And what does the regional order mean for different states that are still alive and standing up? And among those who see the IS as a threat, who are they? What do they do about it? Who and what does IS hurt more? And what I have in mind is the following. Is the fight against IS hold the same meaning for all the parties that fight it? Now, again, whether we like it or not, there is an ideology being expressed by IS, and that is the determining attributes of that is also the determining attributes of at least the judicial system of Saudi Arabia. I mean, what is the difference between the fundamental tenets of Wahhabism and the way it treats certain infringements and the way IS does? Finally, and in this I have a parenthesis, I really don't think we can even equate the spectacle of violence in the Iraq of 1970s that you witnessed with what IS does. IS also does spectacle, but it also does pornography. What this visualization and the kind of violence that they are stage managing, if you will, does have, I guess, a significance that goes way beyond the demonstration effect of violence in earlier authoritarian regimes. I would agree with the proposition that if the IS is smashed in Iraq, it will not be able to survive in Syria. And I think this is where the American policy vis-à-vis Iraq is really being predicated upon. That is, if it can be dried up in Iraq, it may be easier to manage it in Syria, whatever is left of Syria, of course. Since this can only be done with Iranian help, then which way does the IS weigh in the calculus of Arab regimes? That is, even if the Arab regimes are unhappy with the existence and the meaning and the threat that IS might pose, would they prefer to see Iran take the lead in destroying it, since the destruction of IS is going to happen primarily in Iraq? It cannot happen in Syria. Is that going to be something that the Arab regimes will like? And even if the Arab regimes liked it, will the Iranians have it in them to actually do the deed, and then, as Shaban had indicated, and Yazid as well, will they then ask their cooperators or collaborators in Baghdad to actually far more accommodating towards the Sunnis? That is a big question to answer, and I don't really have an answer to that, and it seems to me to be critical. We've talked about this before we came here. Iran really seems to be on cloud nine. I mean, they appear not to be, they appear to be doing no wrong. They are riding high. A lot of Turkish imperialists and non-imperialists are enamored of what the Iranians are doing, but are they overstretching themselves? And if they too are overstretching themselves, then who's going to be there to actually provide order? Then we come to Turkey's position. I mean, I probably know a lot less about the thinking of our rulers than Shaban does, so I wish he had taken that rather unpleasant task upon himself to explain what the Turkish government had done. But I think the Turkish government is now trying to backtrack from serious errors of judgment and policy that it committed in the past 4 years, starting with the Syrian debacle. Because there are a lot of questions that come our way. The first one would be, of course, was it really worth it for the Turkish government to drop Turkey's age-old, non-sectarian, ecumenical approach to foreign policy in the Middle East? Was the risk they've taken really worth it? It really doesn't look like it was to me. In my view, by putting ideological affinity, and thinking that ideological affinity would also return as political gains, the Turkish government slipped Turkey into a pot where it did not know how to swim. Turkey cannot outplay either the Saudis or the Iranians on the sectarian game, and we don't even know how much damage that particular policy has inflicted upon our body politic, and we will not know it until IS, if it does start doing things here, starts doing it. Secondly, the question is, given the very best ambivalent relation with the IS that the Turkish government had, whether or not the Turkish government directly aided and abetted IS, I think there is really no doubt that it has turned its head and it closed its eyes when things were happening across the border. And a lot of organizations affiliated with the Turkish government or the ruling party had been extraordinarily active in helping out the likes of IS, if not just IS itself. And the question then is, was really covering for IS that much worth the risk that was taken? Was it really worth leaving 49 people inside the consulate in Mosul, let them be taken hostage since it was coming, thinking maybe that IS would not hold them hostage? I don't know who could have thought that way, and then using that as an excuse not to help the Kurds when the Kurds were attacked by IS. That really took Turkey, I think, out of the picture when it came to fighting the IS, and in fact the Turkish government's reluctance to fight the IS unless the fight against the IS includes the deposition of Assad. It appears to me basically made Turkey an auxiliary actor rather than a central actor, which we all love being between 2002 and maybe 2012. And of course, the Kobani debacle had played an important part in both stigmatizing Turkey and also giving the opposite result of what the government intended, which was to let IS crush the PKK affiliates. Instead, the PKK, both in Erbil and in Kobani, had gained a legitimacy that would not have been given to it unless the Turkish government behaved the way it did. So finally, with the IS, we have even a bigger problem. Maybe the region's polities are not in a position to actually come up with new thoughts, with new plans, with new ways of cooperating. But the IS thing is, as I said, I find their violence to be nihilistic and all that. Whatever the IS brings to these people who feel more secure under their rule, there is nothing about the future in that rule either. Will a whole region, therefore, allow itself to actually miss out on the 21st century? That question about the future strikes me as probably the most telling, and I don't even know if the elites in the countries of the region are even speaking about those. Finally, about the future. My sense is we will live with the fiction that the borders still exist, and maybe the disappearance of those borders will take a while. That is, those borders that have not been considered legitimate either by Arab nationalists or pan-Islamists still have a life of their own. And in spite of the fact that subnational identities like clans and tribes have actually become where people found refuge. Secondly, I think in any future, let's say IS is cleaned up in Iraq and things are quieter, the administrative structures of regional countries cannot be as centralized as they were before. That, of course, also tells Turkey something. To insist on making our political system even more centralized than it had been before is basically a track of no exit. Finally, will we really all be able to talk about intelligently the redistribution of all sources in the territories where there is a political order? And that's not just oil, it is also how power is going to be redistributed, how water is going to be redistributed, and whether or not we can at some point move beyond or above politics of identity, which actually double as geopolitical struggles as well, and move back towards a more comprehensive identity, whether it be national or just patriotic, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Soli. I mean, in particular, one of the things that I hope from what you said is, towards the end, you talked about, well, even the people that live under Islamic State rule, they feel more secure. Is that a future that they want to hold themselves to? And I think that's interesting. And I want to go back a little bit again. I was just rereading King Abdullah's speech. He raised, one thing he raised the issue that no one talked about it here, but resolution of the Palestinian issue might be the key. Because it feeds on, we know. But I mean, it's an interesting life. For him, of course, it's a matter of life and death. But I mean, the fact that he puts it out there as a way around to find a solution to delegitimize extremism, whatever that is. The second thing is, I really have not seen it already, but had Erdogan given this 4 years ago, or can he still give something like this today and change the equation for Turkey? Because you talked a lot about the sectarian approach, right, which Turkey promotes. And as I was listening to Abdullah, I was saying, well, if the Turkish president could give a speech like this, what would it have meant? Which is totally non-sectarian, inclusive, and so on. These are just a couple of questions. So
First of all, obviously King Abdullah has good genes because remember that when Iraq was first invaded and the Americans basically destroyed the border in Iraq with repercussions elsewhere, he was the first one who won the world against the Shia Crescent. That he now came around to making the kind of speech that he did suggests that he sees there is no end to a sectarian war, that everybody is going to come under if the sectarian war continues. I actually forgot to, I had it in my notes, I forgot to say it. When was the last time Erdogan went to Iraq? Was it before or after the Syrian opposition, the first demonstrations began? It was in March of 2011. It's either immediately before or immediately after Prime Minister Erdogan went to March 2011. No. In March 2011, he also went to Iraq, he went to Baghdad, he went to Najaf and to Erbil, and in Najaf he prayed at the shrine of Caliph Ali, and he had a private audience with Ayatollah Ali Sistani. No other Sunni leader could have done what he had done, and the message was extraordinarily clear. So as he said every time he went to Iraq, we're not either Sunni or Shia, we are Muslims. Whether that was true or not, it doesn't matter. He said what he said. And that they moved within a year from that position to a position of Sunnifying Turkey's position was, in my judgment, a very, very dramatic and very unfortunate turn. We may try to retract from it, but not before our elections.
Shaban.
Actually, you also touched on a very good point. You remember, nothing to Shalom, so you gave this example that can a Turkish leader repeat the same kind of visit to Iraq? And I said, yes, in fact, when you look at the Prime Minister Davutoğlu's visit to Baghdad as foreign minister in the year 2013, he did exactly meet all representatives of different groups, different Shiite groups, and he went to Najaf, Kerbala, Actually, he attended the Erbaim, I guess it was around Erbaim. So I think this sectarian policy, Turkey pursuing a sectarian or Sunni policy, this is over-exaggerated. I personally think Turkey's policy has not been, but the positions we are taking, Turkey is taking for certain political considerations do overlap with the sectarian division. It is hard to explain, but still when we, as I said, even like last week when we were in Baghdad and one of our researchers went down to Necef, Kerbela to meet the local leaders, even he met the local religious leaders, some ayatollahs, and also the Turkmen and displaced Turkmen. Still, you see some sympathy toward Turkey. It is not broken. The link is there. In terms of going from Erdogan's visit to Necef, Kerbela, and breaking up ties with Maliki, it also was rooted in a very strong political reality. It was not just because Erdogan suddenly one morning woke up and decided to pursue a sectarian or Sunni policy. And I remember, we hear this sort of criticism very often, this argument. In 2003, in Washington, D.C., we were organizing an event at the Wilson Center. At that time, everyone was saying, why are you having good ties with Kurds? It's because you are pursuing Sunni-oriented policy in Iraq. Why are you against Maliki? August 2014, after Mosul, again we organized an event at the Wilson Center in the very same room about Iraq. And this time everybody was against Mr. Maliki, and this time the question was, why are not you supporting the Kurds enough? Whereas a year before it was, why are you supporting the Kurds? It's because the Kurds and the Turks are Sunni. I think that is a big part, an issue of perception and framing. Some of the political positions Turkey did take in Syria, in Iraq, and for that matter in Egypt, you can expand it to the broader region. You can either frame them as sectarian or just from different perspectives, pro-democratization, pro-transformation. You can see some sympathy, affinity towards certain groups that's affecting Turkish policy. I don't think Turkey is pursuing a deliberate sectarian policy. And this is where, for instance, I remember back in 2011, people at the very initial phase of the Syrian conflict, they said Turkey and Saudi will be acting together. There will be a Sunni axis. 2 months later, Turkey and Saudi depart. So those judgments about Turkey pursuing a sectarian policy are also looking at selective instances and cases to make a broader case. The way I see it from the very beginning, Turkey has been arguing against what the Prime Minister Davutoglu calls a Cold War in the region, a new Cold War, Shiite-Sunni tensions. Even today, people are, for instance, talking about Turkey, Saudi against Iran. And then I personally, in the morning on the airplane, I was writing an article for our journal on that. Turkey, I don't think will play such a game with Saudi against Iran. The Iraqi policy is a good example. Even in Iraq, right now the big issue is the military assistance to the Sunni groups, right? To balance the Shiite militias, to balance Iran. Even there, you see a lot of resistance in Turkey to provide further weapons to Sunnis, or even to provide weapons to the Turkmen groups that are demanding weapons. So this is partly because Turkey's own concerns about militarization, and because of lack of a clear Iraq policy. These are also factors. But when we say a sectarian policy, we should define what we understand. Let's look at what Iran does in terms of a sectarian policy and what Turkey does. I don't think these two are comparable. In Syria, the opposition that Turkey tried to support, which was in a large part within the context of the broader international coalition. Only about a couple of groups there were disagreements between Turkey and the United States and other allies, but even the military assistance Turkey did provide to the Syrian opposition was framed within the broader context of the Friends of Syria coalition. It was coordinated to a large extent with the American or European assistance. Some of the weapons that ended up in wrong hands in Syria, some of the weapon deliveries that were intercepted, I don't think it was a sole MIT operation. There was a fingerprint as well. So this argument that just look at what has bits here and there to make a bigger argument for sectarian-oriented or Sunni-oriented foreign policy, I personally do not think this is quite the case. And then I want to make one point you did earlier about the lack of regional order. I think this is the big challenge, and the local regional actors are unfortunately not there. In 2010, Holding Center, they did a dialogue and they supported a small project of ours with another colleague, and we went to the region to interview with the elites in the Gulf and blah blah, and we actually were supposed to go to Cairo as well, and because of the Tariq demonstrations, I hardly saved my passport from the Egyptian Consul General in Istanbul. They said you shouldn't go. I took it on Friday late in the evening, so that I can take my flight to Dubai. And then our conclusion from the report that it is sort of a hopeless case. So really, this lack of determination and security competition among the regional actors, this is the big impediment to the region. How we will solve it, I don't know. But you are right, post-American withdrawal, there was a window of opportunity. And I think to a certain extent, Turkey was aiming to fill that vacuum to create sort of a regional-based solution, regional order. But with our capability, I personally have always argued, given Turkey's own capabilities and given the depth of the regional rivalries, it was quite hard for Turkey to initiate some regional platform.
Okay, let's open the floor up. He doesn't. He wants the floor. He wants questions. Right? Yes. So, please don't be shy. See, we are not. So don't be shy. Mr. Ambassador.
Just one comment. Actually, the speakers have covered the question, important question from all aspects, and time is short. I think the reason why I want to take the floor is I felt that I may be the only person here who has a kind of a governmental background. I'm basically from the Turkish Foreign Ministry. I'm a retired ambassador. My name is Tuli Tanç. It's a very important subject. A Pandora's box was opened after the United States invasion of Iraq, and everybody, as a person who knows a little bit about what happened, everybody warned the United States that the Pandora's box was going to be opened with their invasion. And the big problem is how do we then get back all these demons who have come out of the box back in? It's a very difficult question. One factor that was not mentioned here, and which I think is very important, is secularism. The speakers have spoken that President now, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, visited Iraq and mentioned that, you know, we're not of one sect or the other, but we're all Muslims. I think that therein lies the big problem. The reason why Turkey alone is not involved in this confusion and conflict is that after the First World War, Turkey was the only Muslim country that adopted secularism. And that is the only reason why today it is in a different category. Today, the only way I think that we could get over the present conflict is to get out of the whole sectarianism aspect, and even the religious aspect. Now, that's calling for a lot of things, but The only factor that I wanted to contribute to this very valuable meeting is that secularism should also be taken into consideration. Thank you very much.
Anybody more comments? Okay. Sure. Right. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much to all colleagues, panelists. I have 2 points. I would appreciate to have the views of Mr. Saik on both of them. First, whether the territorial integrity of Iraq could be sustainable, could last for the future. If not, if Mr. Saik thinks that it's not sustainable, in that case, whether the current constitution of Iraq is responsible for it. Second point, I would appreciate to hear some assessment regarding the Iranian involvement in Iraqi fight against Islamic State, and in connection with this, what is the assessment of Mr. Saik or other panelists about the apparent rapprochement of the United States towards Iran? Thank you.
Well, let's take one more there and then. Or wait, let's have the answers and then I'll take the second round, okay? All right, yes, Yazid, you start.
Let me say a word about territorial integrity of Iraq first, and the Constitution. I mean, there's never one singular principle causing all these things. I think there's a compound effect. There are many different things that we've seen countries in the region and elsewhere that have very clear, wonderful constitutions, or at least very clear ones, and still, go the wrong way, and others that have no constitution, the United Kingdom, Britain, that manage their affairs. So I don't think there's anything inherent in any constitutional text. What's more interesting is whether there are big debates about the Constitution, i.e. whether there's a process of political debate and engagement about the key concrete issues which gets expressed through a discussion of the Constitution. I mean, if you look at Turkey's history, or at Iran's history, or Egypt's history, you often find that in each case there were moments, 1903 or 1906 or whatever it is for Iran, and other times for Turkey, where there were big struggles over drafting the Constitution because that really represented something. But it's not the text, obviously, that's important. It's finally what socio-political balance it expresses, that is reached and expressed. And that's why I say the Egyptian Constitution now is important. Not because anyone really abided by many parts of it, universal human rights, for instance, but what's critical now in today's Egyptian constitution is that it has given the army, the police, the judiciary total autonomy from the law, for instance. And that's just something that sort of reflects reality, but now that they've formalized it. So I think constitutions themselves aren't the critical factor, they represent something you reach, finally, a final outcome. Or delay an outcome, as in Tunisia's new constitution, which has allowed the country to move a bit further in its democratic transition without really resolving some of the big issues. So there's been a delaying process. Iraq's problems, Iraq has been a troubled state since 1920-22. It's never really been at peace with itself. The fact that ISIS was able to take over Mosul in the north is partly because the people of Mosul historically, even till today, still don't really look to Baghdad as their center. They look to Diyarbakir or to Aleppo. Their historical imagining, they're Sunni Iraqi Arabs, like the ones in Baghdad, for instance, but for them, Mosul is a part of something else. And that's partly why ISIS ended up with a stronghold in Mosul, because if you look at the incidents of violence during the American occupation, Mosul was one of the last places for the violence to end against the Americans in 2006, 7, 8. And that's, there are historical social reasons why that is. So the territorial integrity of Iraq, I think I was suggesting very clearly, is we have a de facto partition today. There are many Iraqis who don't yet accept that. Shia, Sunnis, even some Kurds. I think basically almost all Kurds want independence in Iraq. But there are some like the PUK who still think that they have to operate and cooperate with Baghdad. But let's focus on the Arab community. Many Sunnis and Shia still believe in some sort of central and unitary, not even a federal state. What's happened though now is that increasingly more and more people are starting to think we don't want our sons dying in Tikrit or whatever. I mean, people in the south are now starting to say, why should our sons die in other parts of the country? I mean, just as we hear from Syria, Alawis, let's say, of Tartus or Homs say, why should we die in Deir ez-Zor in Syria? So their notion of a single territory, of a national territory, is fragmented. And once that starts to shift more, it becomes very difficult to have genuinely a unitary national identity or political system. Whether that's a better thing or worse thing, the American invasion was part of it. The policies applied after the invasion are part of it. Saddam's policies before were part of it. I mean, to sort of say it's just the Americans' fault or it's just Saddam's fault, it's all these different things coming together in a certain way. Which ties into something Solly was saying about the 1990s and the inclusive system or not. I mean, I just want to bring this in because of how much of history, even recent history, do we remember, even when it's useful to help us understand our current behavior. I mean, Solly is right in suggesting that in the 1990s the Saddam state became much more predatory, brittle, hard, because it was deprived of oil and of its budget. And therefore its ability to be inclusive by giving patronage, welfare, infrastructure, housing to everyone was reduced. One of the things it did was to emphasize clan loyalty, patriarchal, male-dominated, conventional, paternalistic and patriarchal values. And he devolved a lot of authority for social order and policing to local clan sheikhs, who previously had been very weakened, now were revived and given authority over their own clan membership. And in that way he inculcated the return to very conservative, male-oriented social values that we now see. But what he also did, for instance, because he couldn't afford healthcare and so on, is he allowed Shia religious networks as well to take a lot more autonomy in providing social services that the state used to claim as its monopoly, and allowed people like the father of Muqtada al-Sadr, who's now a radical Islamic cleric, his father set up a big network in the 1990s of charitable, religious-based charities to do things that the state no longer could do. So he allowed it both ways. And of course then Muqtada al-Sadr eventually ended up, inheriting.
But those separated communities from one another.
Sure, I mean, they're also, and look, the inherent sectarianism was hidden in Iraq. It's not that it didn't exist, but it was managed in many different ways. I also want to say something about, the ambassador's comment about Turkey not getting pulled into the void of the chaos, thanks to its secularism. I mean, yes and no. I don't think it's because of its secularism, frankly. Let me put this slightly differently. I think things like secularism and sectarianism, they don't just exist as a value that we sort of adopt and then, thanks, we've got secularism, so we're okay. I mean, it's not quite how it works. How did Turkey become secular is important to that story. How was it maintained as a secular structure? How did it become that finally you get an Islamist party, the IAK party, which comes out of, Erdogan and Refah and Fazilat and all that, and one day finally someone comes along like Erdogan, and this is my understanding, you'll tell me I'm wrong, who says, no, we are Islamist and we live in a secular state. I mean, he may want to change that one day, I don't know, but in Turkey, the historical trajectory was one in which the secular state became the framework within which all politics was conducted, including religious politics, so far. But we're talking about Arab societies, which are very different, they're not all alike. I mean, the trajectory is different, but I want to make just one really central point here. It's how I think about these things. In just 40 years ago, the first half of the 1970s, all Arab states the majority of the population, I believe in all, I can say that safely, 42 years ago, was still rural. More people lived in the countryside, in villages and small towns, than in the cities. Today, the majority of all Arab societies, maybe with the exception of Yemen, are urban. Cairo is as big as Istanbul, Amman, Zarqa, Sultan in Jordan, which is a tiny country, is a huge metropolis now. Damascus, Aleppo, Casablanca, Algiers. That's social transformation. That's a huge social transformation in just 40 years of rural migration to the cities, but rural migration with still rural conservative values, social networks, family kinship relations, many different things. At the same time as concentration of wealth in the hands of small elites linked to those in power, so oligarchic capital. So a certain kind of social transformation, which was not reflected in modern, let's say, political opening up or liberalization. You had privatization in the last 10 or 15 years, which created more concentrated wealth in the hands of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and his sons and so on, or Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, or Zayn al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia. So, whereas in Turkey, and you all know this, from the 1930s onwards, the processes of secularism weren't just secularism. They were about industrialization, the creation of a capitalist society based on big business investment, increasingly from the 60s and 70s. And when the military took over every time, it was to promote a particular idea of their vision of how Turkey should modernize economically and industrially. In their concept, it was about big business, you know, Ak and Sabancı and Koç and Oyak, etc. So it was capitalist development of a certain kind with a large private sector and so on. Whereas Egypt, which is the similar sort of structure, you know, army intervention, republicanism, all this, there was no private sector for many years. And on the contrary, what you've had is totally crony, predatory capitalism in the last 10 or 15, right at the top. What I'm saying in a very sort of long way is that it's all that that's happened in Turkey. It's not just secularism as an ideology. It's the fact that it was embedded in certain social relations, in certain capitalist developments, in certain political forms, which every now and then the army corrected, you know, in 1970 or in 1980, when things went wrong. The left labor organizations in the 70s got too militant, etc. So you had social transformation, and the social transformation that's brought the AK party to power was based on the 1980s, Özel, liberalization, the rise of the European Union, and how Turkish capitalism integrated into all that. It created a whole new class. What is the Anatolian bourgeoisie? It's a whole new class. So you had massive social transformation, but it had certain political and economic forms that allowed secularism to revive even within Islamist government. The Arab countries had massive social transformation with none of that kind of capitalist vision, if you like, big business or small business or whatever you want to call it, and none of the politics with it. So it's producing a different kind of outcome with a different discourse. So yes, secularism, I think, it's my preference, but I don't approach it from that point. I start by saying, okay, let's take Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood come to power, they're Islamist, I don't agree with it, this is not a Muslim Brotherhood beard, by the way, and I have a tie, by the way, secular, it's just, but I need it later. The Egypt, when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, they didn't start a program of economic reform that democratized the economy. The economy was still based on those people with access to, you know, contracts and to decision-making power, and who could milk the state, and that's still how it's run. They didn't open up the economy to the equivalent of the Anatolian bourgeoisie. There is no Anatolian bourgeoisie in Egypt. The structure doesn't work like that. So you're not going to get whatever you want to call it, secularism, democracy, in a country where wealth is concentrated at the top and goes to those who have the best access to power. You know, that's what, of course, Erdogan is now being accused of, that finally he's starting to, you know, benefit himself and his relatives. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it's interesting that that is now, you know, one of the accusations. But that's what you already have in Egypt, or in Tunisia, or in Yemen, or in Saudi Arabia. So where will secularism come from? Where will democracy come from? I mean, any ism. I'll leave questions about Iran for others. I don't have a view on that.
You want to answer?
What?
It was the Iraqi soil. With his own hands.
I might have seen Qasim Suleyman big car. No, I mean, yeah, the influence is very visible on the ground. The Shia militia, the mobilization is strong. And then when I talk to the people, as I really try to emphasize, the urgency of fighting is more important than in other political considerations. And Iran is seen as the only actor that was there with the military assistance. This is also true, by the way, for the northern part of the Kurdistan regional government. Even the Kurds are talking about how Iran was faster than other actors in terms of providing the military assistance. And this is changing the dynamics on the ground, but as for in the long run, especially given the Iranian involvement in Syria and other proxy wars, to what extent it is sustainable, to what extent Iran can maintain the same level of commitment to it is questionable. But regarding the US-Iranian rapprochement or coordination, my personal belief is that I mean, Iraq, maybe it was last week on Monday or Tuesday, one senior advisor to the Iranian president, he said that now Iraq is part of our empire, maybe we also saw the same comments. It created a lot of reaction in Turkey, but also in Iraq as well. On that day, the day after, we were in the Iraqi parliament meeting some MPs. You could see the reaction, but then some of the Sunni MPs told us that even when they were having the session, we could overhear other Shiite MPs talking. They are quite troubled by such comments, but they cannot openly tell them. So that also shows you the influence. And then the common wisdom, which is also very often heard in Turkey, is that in a sense there is a sort of concordat between the United States and Iran, leaving Iraq to Iranian sphere of influence. Personally, I don't think we have such a big, major strategic understanding. It is largely because of the American unwillingness or inability to do much on the ground, and this is part of Obama's strategic patience approach, that they don't want to get involved militarily on the ground, no boots on the ground. And whoever is there to do the job that's needed to be done, there is a sort of a marriage of convenience rather than some big strategic level coordination or cooperation. That's my personal take on it.
Let's take quickly two more questions, last two, because Yazid Said has to leave in about a minute. So you and then Gökçe. Yes.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for your speeches. I have very short three questions. One of these, just three very fast. One of these for Mr. Said. Bibi the elections in Israel, Bibi is elected again. So what is the effects of Bibi's election again? And also the conflict of IS in Lebanon, and how it's going to affect Lebanon, these both things. Second one is actually to Mr. Özal. Actually, I try to wonder, I think we can all agree that the winners are very obvious. I mean, the Iran, Assad, and I guess the Kurds in the region are the winners, but when we come to the losers, I have a question on that. I believe my country is one of the losers, unfortunately. And how this conflict, at the end of this conflict or during this conflict, how it's going to affect the peace process of Kurdish, the ongoing peace process? How it's going to affect this? And after this conflict, what's going to be our relationship with the extremists? Because there's a social base there, so the extremism will be there in our region. So what's going to be our relationship with those people in the region? And last question is to the Kardash. Actually, I have a very quick one as well. Thank you very much for briefly describing the Iran's role in Iraq, but as you know that right now we are discussing that they are going to have a role in Bahrain, they are going to have a role in Yemen. So in the larger region, how the Saudis actually balance the power of the Iraq? Thank you very much.
Wow, short questions, yes. Gershon.
Thank you. I want to ask a little more about Kurds because you made some comments, but you didn't make clear comments for me. Maybe you can just shortly comment on how would you evaluate the role of Kurds in any possible scenarios regarding ISIS, and because even when I consider the Iranian involvement in the region now against ISIS, I think about the relations between the Iranian government and the Kurdish minority in Iran as well. So their ideology about the Kurdish issue in the region even. So how would you evaluate their role in any possible region?
Okay. So, Yazid, so you want to start?
Yazid should have the last word. Yazid should have the last
Well,
word.
if I need to leave her, then
He needs to leave also.
So you too.
Yeah, we will try to end.
We'll leave the elections in Israel as well, because I'm going
The elections in Israel, we're going to have a meeting on it. You're welcome to come. So I won't talk about it. On Iran, look, if my suggestion is correct, that for some reason or other, this region cannot pull its own act together and bring order, it will need global powers, and global powers, certainly the United States, is not interested in sticking here, be as committed here as it used to be. Under those circumstances, and given the fact that the US wishes to open up to Asia, it makes perfect sense geopolitically for the United States to find accommodation in Iran. That, of course, means it has to assuage the fears of both Israel and Saudi Arabia. And that is, in my estimation, the big search for the moment. I kind of agree with Shaban instinctively that no country in this region can be all that powerful, that probably the Iranians are overstretching, and if somebody in Iran said, this is now part of our empire, welcome to your demise. It's begun, okay? So everybody will come back to their own size. On the Kurdish issue, Turkey is not necessarily a loser. Turkey is probably guilty, or the Turkish government, not Turkey. Turkish government is guilty of over-promising and under-delivering. Okay, and so long as it does not face its own realities, it will continue to under-deliver. As for the Kurds ended up with the short end of the stick back in 1918 to 22. They now were given a historical opportunity, and I don't think the Kurdish issue is going to be resolved nationally in the 4 different countries where they reside. We now have a politics of Kurdistan, and different parts of Kurdistan relate to one another. The Turkish Kurds may choose rationally to become full citizens with, of course, interest in the other parts of Kurdistan to the south, but then how the Turkish government is going to manage it is going to be the critical ingredient.
Okay.
Yeah, briefly on the Kurds, actually, Al Jazeera interview, there was a couple of issues back, a special issue on the Kurds in Europe. I was a couple of others. That was an interesting debate. I also think that there is a regional dimension of Kurds in each country will also involved in the local dynamics. I mean, Turkey, a different story, Iraq, a different, and Syria. We cannot have a single Kurdish reality. But in the case of Iraq, I mean, the opportunity seems to be there, but I mean, when we do visit the northern part of Iraqi Kurdistan, I mean, sometimes they're also over-inflating their expectations. Now we see a bigger realization of their limits, especially after August you see a drastic sea change. Saudi balancing of Iran, I think there is not much they can do directly vis-a-vis Iran. They cannot openly confront. And if they really want to pursue that route, what they can do, they will probably deepen the proxy wars, the other divisions. And this is where I see a risk. But I am at the same time optimistic that they won't go that route because of the new king's policy of having a more moderate approach to regional rivalries than his predecessor, especially the previous intelligence chief, Bandar's way of doing things. They also saw the sort of negative effects of that route in Syria. It became counterproductive. So I don't think they will be able to mount a big challenge against Iran. That's where I also agree that the Iranian sort of winning mood is also overinflated. I don't think we can talk about a winner. I always say we usually decide who wins, who fails at the end of the game, right? So, but the game is still unfolding. So we cannot really tell. We should be really cautious about our assessments of the performance of actors in this game. It changes from one month to another on the ground. So it's a very solid, it's not a fluid environment. We should be really careful. And unfortunately, it's going to be a long game. So that's where perhaps sometimes I sort of think Turkey's approach of caution is also warranted. At the moment, we seem to be on the losing side, as you defined it, but we don't know what contingencies will arise, who will stay on top at the end of the game, so we should be a little bit patient.
Well, I'll just start first, since I have to run, I apologize, but I have to be somewhere else, and I'm worried about the traffic. I'd be very happy to hear from you.
It's good in Istanbul.
No, I mean, well, especially if you use public transport. I'm getting around very quickly, but I have to get up to Taksim, it's a little bit more complicated. But you're very welcome to contact me. Dimitri has my email address, can join our mailing list to see what we put out. So do get in touch. Having said that, thanks for coming. I'm doing all my goodbyes first. I just wanted to pick on the issue of the Islamic State in Lebanon, that bit of the question. I mean, that's part of a wider question, which is Islamic State's impact beyond its own borders. I mean, that's what's interesting more broadly. Because I focused on Islamic State in Iraq and as an Iraqi phenomenon, and to some extent as a Syrian one. What's very interesting about it is the impact it's had beyond that sort of natural habitat. So in Lebanon, Jordan, Tunisia, Gaza, Egypt. And because that seems to confirm that in reality it is a transnational global movement, and not just an Iraqi one. And so in a way my response about Lebanon is part of this wider response, which is that I think in areas that go further away from its core territory, the Islamic State means, I guess, different things or many things to different people. And that's what's fascinating. Al-Qaeda, when it emerged in this dramatic way, especially in 2001, of course, it was already around before, was very dramatic. It did something that everyone saw. And yet, it didn't receive the same didn't have the same reception among Arab or Muslim audiences around Arab countries at least, and maybe not even other Muslim societies. Only very small sort of fringe or marginal groups responded in a powerful way to Al-Qaeda. I would again say, put it in this form, which is that Al-Qaeda did not have a social constituency. I mean, you support Jumhuriyat Party or MHP or HDP in this country because you're Kurdish or you're right-wing, middle-class, secular, Dutch or whatever. I mean, there's a reason, a sociological pattern to your politics. Who joins a transnational movement that has no base, has no, it's unless you maybe are a nomadic transnational person. And that's why a lot of the people who were drawn to Al-Qaeda were young men who had, migrated from city to city. That's its natural social constituency. Islamic State has a very different appeal. I mean, first of all, its impact has been massive in these other Arab societies. Unlike Al-Qaeda, people want to go fight there, partly because Islamic State has succeeded. It has a territory. It looks like a state. It thinks like a state. It wants to be seen like a state. A particular kind of state, a brutal one, a horrific one, all these other things. And incidentally, I'm not sure that the pornography of the violence of Islamic State is greater than that of, say, Muhammad Gaddafi or Saddam. The destruction of old Baghdad. I was there in the mid-70s when almost the last neighborhood was moved to make way for modern buildings, because this is modernity. There are many reasons why people destroy old things. Muhammad Gaddafi used to hang people in stadiums and invite the population to come and attend because that was a public spectacle. Hangings, and then they put them on TV as well. Which is more obscene? I don't know. They're all pornographic, frankly. It's not about which is better or less or more. The point is that what makes thousands of Tunisians want to join the Islamic State? What makes Lebanese want to join? And I think in each case, it's not about the Islamic State's claim to the caliphate. That helps. But the bottom line is that in Tunisia, people in, say, southern parts of the country, where most of the recruits come from, are totally marginalized, impoverished, unemployed. They expected more from the revolution. The revolution didn't change things. And they saw the same elite game going on in the capital. So for them, in a way, they are fighting their marginalization. And here comes along someone who is heroic and dramatic and, is anti-system, is challenging the whole system successfully. In somewhere else, there are no Shia in Tunisia, but they're joining, they buy into the sectarian discourse. It has no real relevance to them, but it's just part of the package. In Lebanon, it's about the disempowerment of the Sunnis who feel that Hezbollah, the Shia, others have taken over the country. And so they're responding for a slightly different reason. But there too, most of the response is among the underclass, the inner city neighborhoods in Tripoli or Sidon, the people who most middle-class Sunnis wouldn't talk to, because they're inferior, they're barefoot, they're marginal. That's why most of the people who went to fight in Syria have come from a few regions of Lebanon, although most of the Sunni population is also in Beirut and Sidon, but most of the recruits for the jihad come from Tripoli and Akka in the north. I'm not saying, again, you're poor, therefore you're jihadists. No. I'm just saying that there's a strong pattern there. And why people respond to the Islamic State in Lebanon is different from Tunisia or Jordan. Again, where there are no Shia and almost no Christians. Most of the recruits come from the huge underclass of Zarqa and Amman. In 2008, the government admitted that at least 38% of the population were at or below the poverty line. 2008. The Prime Minister, who I knew well, told me in private that it was probably even higher. He admitted this. That's a huge number of people. And that happened in just the last 10 or 20 years due to the massive, privatization, liberalization, and huge income disparity. And I have friends in Jordan who run little businesses and companies and so on, and their own workers. They tell me, one friend said, one of his employees has 3 brothers fighting for the Islamic State in Iraq. Another told me that one of his workers, I forget what it was exactly, said to him, "We're going to come for you next." This is class grievance. This is about the people in the underclass who see the people in West Amman driving BMWs, Mercedes cars, living in villas. And as far as they can see, everything that changed in the economy and the decline of social welfare enriched these people and marginalized them. So there are all these different things. It's like the story of the blind man and the elephant. We all touch a different bit of the elephant, and someone says it's thin like a tail, and someone says it's thick like a leg. And it's all these things. So it's fascinating in a way. It plays on this. But then to go back to Saddam Hussein's state, he used Arab nationalism, Palestine, even Islam in 1990. He used them all to appeal to audiences in Morocco. Tens of thousands demonstrated in Algiers in 1990 in support of Saddam's invasion of Iraq, of Kuwait. You think why did they do that? Again, it's this interplay between the discourse and the local dynamics. So people, I think, are fighting their own issues in Tunisia or Algeria or Lebanon, but now they're doing this using the Islamic State as an example of someone who is the total antithesis, the total opposite to the entire system that they think is selfish, elitist, and marginalizing them. And they each interpret it in a somewhat different way. So in Lebanon, again, I mean, whether the Islamic State will have a real foothold in Lebanon, I don't think so. Jabhat al-Nusra maybe will have a foothold in Lebanon, because Jabhat al-Nusra is, as I was arguing earlier, is the one that comes from the same social milieu of Western Syria, Eastern Lebanon, that border area, the families, the village economy, etc. It's the same one. Nusra will be powerful in Lebanon, in some parts of Lebanon. The question for Lebanon is, will there be a moment when large parts of the middle class, or the lower middle class, Sunnis, will finally start to get excited and to feel here finally someone who will change the balance of power inside Lebanon. So far this is a marginal class thing. If the larger, small middle class of Sunnis in Lebanon starts to say, finally we have a champion, like they did with Abdel Nasser in the 50s and 60s, Arab nationalism, or with the PLO in the 60s and 70s, they found their champion to change the balance of power in Lebanon. The risk now is that they will find in Nusra or Islamic State this new champion. It's not sure because of Lebanon being, half Shia, half Christian, half all these other things. But that's my interpretation anyway.
Well,
and it's 3:06.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers for their wonderful presentations, comments, ideas, input, and thank you all for listening. And hope to see you soon again. Thank you.